Hello everyone, welcome to another anatomy video. It's good to be back. I do apologize for not keeping up with all my anatomy videos. I know a lot of you students did enjoy those. A lot of different things came about in my life. I'm currently studying for the MCAT, so I've been dedicating lots of time towards that. And then on top of that, I'm taking OChem, and then the pandemic occurred, so there's a lot of different things going on that prevented me from making these videos. However, I'm making one right now since I have a little bit more time on my hands. And I'm doing it with a different style. When I was writing out all the terms and drawing lines and arrows and circling, I felt like it was beneficial, but at the same time, I felt like it was a waste of time for you guys to watch me write out each term. And I want you guys to use your time studying effectively. So we're going to try it this way. And if you guys don't like it, I'll go back to the way I was doing it before. But for this video, we're going to try a new method of teaching landmarks. So the first anatomical landmarks I'm going to be covering on the heart are the external landmarks found on the heart. So the first one being the base of the heart. And the reason why it's called a base is because it's the broad, more flattened part of the heart. If we think of it as like a patella, there's the base of patella, which is the more broad and flat part. And then we got the pointed part, which is called the apex, which is located down here. This is the apex of the heart. Now the heart, like many other organs, have surfaces, and the first one we're going to cover is the sternocostal surface, or the anterior surface of the heart. Remember to parent these surfaces back to the heart. Now the reason why it's called the sternocostal surface is because it's right up against the sternum on the posterior aspect of the bone, and it's also behind the ribs found in the thoracic cage. So that's why either term is acceptable for sternocostal surface or anterior surface of the heart. The next surface we need to know is the diaphragmatic surface of the heart. Now don't be confused because it says diaphragmatic that it sits on top of the diaphragm, because it doesn't. The lungs do. But this is the surface closest to the diaphragm compared to any other surface located on the heart. So the inferior portion of the heart is called the diaphragmatic surface of the heart. And you can call it either inferior surface or the diaphragmatic surface of the heart. The next set of surfaces we have are called the pulmonary surfaces. And the reason why they're called pulmonary surfaces is because there are lungs on either side of the heart, on the right side and on the left. So make sure you are specific when identifying the right and left surfaces, pulmonary surfaces of the heart, because you need to be left and right specific when referring to these surfaces. Now the next landmark that we need to find on the heart is called the coronary groove, and it's this indentation found near the superior part of this organ. Now, the interesting thing about the coronary groove is that it separates the superior chambers on the top from the inferior chambers on the bottom. Or in other words, it separates the atria from the ventricle. So this groove right here is called the coronary groove of the heart. Now we can go ahead and move on to this next groove. And this groove right here is called the anterior interventricular groove of the heart. And like the name suggests, this groove is between the two ventricles, the one on the right and the one on the left. And since there's an anterior interventricular groove of the heart, we can assume that there's going to be a posterior interventricular groove of the heart. And we'll get to that when we go on the posterior aspect of the heart. But first we have these two last landmarks, which are located here. And these are called the left and right auricles of the heart. The reason why they're called auricles is because they are very similar, and well, they look very similar to ears. So that's why they call them auricles, left and right auricles of the heart. Now we can go ahead and move to the posterior aspect of the heart. And right here, again, we see the posterior interventricular groove of the heart. So we had one on the anterior aspect, and now we have one on the posterior aspect. And again, this groove is located between the two ventricles. Now this term right here I do not believe is found in your textbook, but I find it to be very important to learn, and especially for students trying to understand how the heart works. Now the coronary sinus is responsible for receiving all the deoxygenated blood from the heart. You have different arteries that are supplying the heart blood because the heart also needs oxygenated blood in order to function, and then the coronary sinus returns the deoxygenated blood back into the right atrium, and we'll see more of the coronary sinus when we get to the right atrium. But I would know this vessel right here is called the coronary sinus. Now again, this is just another line showing the coronary groove, and it's the groove that separates the left and right atrium from the left and right ventricles of the heart. Now, layers of the heart. So there's only 3 layers, which is really helpful when it comes to learning these. Now the most superficial one is called the epicardium. Okay, so epicardium is all this superficial tissue found out here in the external surface. The next layer is called the myocardium. Now, the myocardium is definitely the thickest because that's where a lot of cardiac muscle cells are. And that's why it's called myo referring to muscle. So this meaty stuff right here, this is the myocardium. And then the deepest of all layers is called the endocardium. And that is just, like I said, it's the deepest layer of the heart, and it's the endocardium. And it just layers the inside or the deepest portions of the heart. Now, I want to break down the heart into its 4 chambers and discuss all the landmarks found within each one. But before I do that, there are 2 landmarks that I need to discuss in order for everything else to make sense. The first one being the interatrial septum of the heart, and that's located right here. Now, we've heard of septum before. Remember, septum pellucidum. The septum means a barrier between chambers. In this case, it's a barrier between the atria, and that's why it's called the interatrial septum, just like the septum pellucidum was a barrier between the lateral ventricles. So that is interatrial septum of the heart, and just like the atria, the ventricles also have a division, and it's called the interventricular septum of the heart, and it's located right here where my laser is pointing at. So I'm going to start right where blood is received into the heart, which is the right atrium of the heart. So the first thing I want to discuss is this space. Now, the space where blood is received from both the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava is called sinus venerum cavarum. And there isn't really any trick to remember the name. You just gotta kind of have to memorize it. But sinus venerum cavarum is where the blood is received into the right atrium. Now, I already mentioned these vessels, the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava come and dump deoxygenated blood into the right atrium, and they go through these openings, and these openings are called the opening of the superior vena cava and the opening of the inferior vena cava. So pretty self-explained there. Now, you may see this black dot located right here, and that's called the opening of the coronary sinus. Now, I already mentioned what the coronary sinus is and what it does, and that's its opening. So it dumps deoxygenated blood from the heart into the right atrium of the heart through this opening, which is called the opening of the coronary sinus. Now, in this image, you can't really see, but if you were handling a model, you would see a small depression right here, just about right here. And that's called fossa ovalis of the heart. Now, to give you a description of what the fossa ovalis is, the fossa ovalis, when we were within the womb, before we were conceived, we had an opening right here. And it was actually called foramen ovale of the heart. Now, this opening allowed blood to move from the right atrium into the left atrium. But when we were born, that opening was sealed off and left a depression, and it's called the fossa ovalis of the heart. Okay, and I'll go more into detail of the foramen ovale of the heart when we go over the circulatory system. But right now, we're just going over landmarks of the heart. So just remember, this is the fossa ovalis of the heart. Now, within the atria, and when I say atria, that's plural for atrium. So within the atria, we have muscles lining the chamber within this space right here. And those muscles that are lining this area are called pectinate muscles. And they are only located in the atria. They're not found in the ventricles. So remember that. Now, the last landmark that I need to discuss that's located in the right atrium is called the intervenous tubercle. Now, what the heck does that mean? Well, venous mean vein. So we have 2 veins, right? We have the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, and it's between the 2, and it's a tubercle. We know a tubercle is like a bump or a ridge, right? Now, why on earth would we have a bump right here between the superior and the inferior vena cava? Well, right here is these arrows represent blood flowing into the heart. Now, just imagine right now, many of us have dealt with like a garden hose before. Now, if we had 2 garden hoses and we connected them together and we turn on the faucet on both ends of these hoses, pressure would build within the hoses, and it's possibly going to make them explode. Now, the same thing would occur if blood was coming in from the superior vena cava in the inferior vena cava, and they were just battling it out right here. The pressure from both the inferior and the superior would build up right here. Now, if we put an intravenous tubercle right here, blood is actually deflected from this bump and it actually pushes it towards the right ventricle, and that is the function of the intravenous tubercle. So I hope that kind of helps you imagine how that works. It's a pretty cool landmark if you think about it. Now, we're done with the right atrium, and we can go ahead and move on to the right ventricle of the heart. And the first thing we need to discuss is this opening, which is regulated by different cusps. This whole thing is called the right atrioventricular valve, or you can even call it the tricuspid valve. Now, I'm not going to go over all the different cusps found within the valve. There are plenty of images online you can look up, and also your anatomy lab book describes them fairly well. But I just want you to know that this is called the right atrioventricular valve, or the tricuspid valve. Now, just like the atria had their own specialized muscles, the ventricles, they also have specialized muscles that are only found within the ventricles themselves, and these are called papillary muscles. Now, if this helps you remember papillary means nipple, or papilla means nipple, and if you look at these little bumps right here, they almost appear nipple-like. So that's why they call them papillary muscles, because they almost they appear to look like nipples. Now, attached to these papillary muscles are these little strings or web-like tendons, and those are called Chordae tendineae, or you can call them tendinous cords. And that's the English translation from Chordae tendineae. Now, those cords, they go from the papillary muscle, and they attach all the way to the cusps of the right atrioventricular valve as well as the left atrioventricular valve. So every papillary muscle has Chordae tendineae coming off of them. So that should be quite easy to remember. The next thing we have is this Trabeculae carneae. Now, carne means meat, and Trabeculae, I believe, means sponge. So it looks like spongy meat. So if you look down here in the model, all this different web-like or sponge-looking like muscle, that is called Trabeculae carneae. Now, the next landmark I'm going to mention, I will go into more detail later in this video, and this is called Trabecula septum marginalis. And it is a little landmark that goes from the interventricular septum, and it goes all the way across to this side of the chamber of the right ventricle. Okay, this little band, it looks like a little piece of Trabeculae carneae coming off from this wall and then inserting into this side. Again, that's called Trabecula septum marginalis. And I'll go into more detail what that does later in the video. Okay, now the last landmark that we need to go over in the right ventricle of the heart is CONUS arteriosus of the heart or infundibular of the heart. Either term is acceptable. And all that is the space where blood is pushed towards the pulmonary valve and then entering the pulmonary trunk. Okay, so CONUS arteriosus, and it's called CONUS because it kind of makes a cone shape right here, or you can call it infundibulum of the heart. That just leads it to the pulmonary valve, which you cannot see. This model doesn't have the valve. The valve would be right around here. This is part of the pulmonary trunk right here, but it's been cut off for display reasons. Cool. Now, so we can think of the blood going through the pulmonary trunk into the pulmonary arteries, going away from the heart, going through the lungs, being oxygenated and dumping out CO2, and then coming back to the left atrium of the heart. Now, the vessels that bring that oxygenated or the oxygen-rich blood back to the heart are called pulmonary veins. And if you see these holes right here, these black dots represent openings, and those are called openings of the pulmonary veins. And there are actually 4 of them, but from this view in the photograph, you can only see 3 of them. But there are indeed 4 of them that come and they dump the blood into the left atrium of the heart. And that is the only landmark that we need to know for the left atrium of the heart. And now we can go ahead and move to the left ventricle of the heart. Now again, we have the left atrioventricular valve, or you can call it the mitral valve. And that's located right here. Now, right here we have the aorta, and we'll learn its parts when we learn about the circulatory system and all the vessels and arteries and veins. And right here is called the aortic valve, and it's just a valve that is regulated and closes, open and closes the aorta. Now those are all the different landmarks found on the left ventricle of the heart. Now just because I didn't add more terms on the left hand side of the screen doesn't mean there aren't more landmarks found in this chamber. You still have your papillary muscles, you still have your Chordae, tendineae located here, as well as your Trabeculae, carne down here. So they are existing on both sides of the ventricles, but as far as specific landmarks only found in the left ventricle of the heart, you only have these two, the left atrioventricular valve and the aortic valve. Now, the conducting system of the heart is so cool, and I'm not going to go over the physiology of it, but I will go over the anatomy of it. Now, the conducting system of the heart is made up of conducting cardiac muscle fibers, and the more common term used are Purkinje fibers. But for whatever reason, the anatomy department wants us to learn Purkinje fibers as conducting cardiac muscle cells, and that's fine. We'll have to live with that. But do know that Purkinje fibers and conducting cardiac muscle cells are the same thing. Now, if you look where my arrow is pointing, there's like this green patch right here. On the models, it's colored green. It's kind of hard to see in this photograph, but this is called the sinoatrial node, and this is like this is the first center of where conduction occurs. It sends out an impulse, and it goes down, and it impulses and conducts all these different muscles found in the atria, and then it goes down to the next node, which is called the atrioventricular node, and it's located right here. And it does the same thing, but it's partially delayed so that the ventricles don't contract at the same moment as the atria do. So that's why we have our lub-dub instead of just lub, because we don't want the atria and the ventricles to contract at the same time. So again, this is where the atrioventricular node is. Now the atrioventricular node has a bundle of conducting cardiac muscle cells, and they go down here, and this little patch right here, you can see this line right there, that's called the atrioventricular bundle, and that bundle splits within the interventricular septum into two parts, and it's shown right here. You have your right crus of the atrioventricular bundle, and then you have your left crus of the atrioventricular bundle. Now, crura is plural, so you can say left and right crura of the atrioventricular bundle, and you'd be referring to both legs, because crus means leg. And that is all. Oh, and I forgot one last thing. So I mentioned before about the Trabeculae septum marginalis. It was located right here. Let me go ahead and just draw that in real quick. So let's pretend this blue line is the Trabeculae septum marginalis. Now, it's quite amazing. As impulses go down the atrioventricular bundle and down to the right crus of the atrioventricular bundle, you can see that it would take much longer to go all the way down towards the apex of the heart and then back up to be able to send impulses to this side of the right ventricle. And because of that, through evolution, we have evolved to make this a shortcut, and that is what the Trabeculae septum marginalis is. It's a shortcut for impulses to even skip across and then be able to make it to this side instead of going all the way down and back up. Now, that doesn't mean impulses don't make it all the way down to the apex and then back up. They do, but another portion of the impulses do make it across the Trabeculae septum marginalis and help contraction of the right ventricle that way. Pretty amazing if you really think about it, how we've evolved in that fashion. Okay, now this is the last slide, and I already have all the terms listed here. I don't have any arrows because this image I found online kind of already does that. So I'm just going to go over each one for us. Now we have the visceral. So first off, let me explain what we're dealing with. There is a sac of fluid that the heart sits in. And the example I've always been told is, imagine your fist is being pressed up against a water balloon. And that water balloon kind of encapsulates around your fist. and that's what this sac is. And that sac is called pericardium. And you can kind of see right here this sac that's kind of going around and envelops the entirety of the heart. So that's called pericardium, this entire sac. Now this sac has different layers to it, and it has different names. Now the layer that's just right up against the heart, it actually adheres to the heart, and it's actually part of the epicardium. So this layer is actually called the visceral layer of the serous pericardium, or you can call it visceral pericardium. And this is the exact same thing as epicardium. So we now know the layer that adheres right up against the heart is called the visceral layer of the serous pericardium, or visceral pericardium. And that is the exact same thing as epicardium. Now, between the visceral layer of the serous pericardium, we have this other layer, and this is the more external layer of the pericardium, and this is called the parietal layer of the serous pericardium, or you can just call it parietal pericardium. And between the visceral pericardium and the parietal pericardium, we have this space right here, and this space is called the pericardial cavity. And this pericardial cavity is filled with pericardial fluid. And the reason we have this pericardium is actually to reduce friction. Now, the heart is constantly beating throughout your body, and this pericardial sac, just the pericardium, it actually helps reduce friction because of all this pericardial fluid that's surrounding the heart in its entirety. And that's it. Those are all the different parts of the heart, as well as the pericardium and the layers and the different landmarks. I hope this method of learning was a lot easier and more effective compared to me just writing out all the terms and drawing out arrows and such. But if you do prefer me to write it out so you guys have time to take notes along with me, I'll just go back to the way I was teaching it. I was just trying to make it so it's easier for you guys to learn. But whatever you guys want, just let me know in the comments below, or you can just direct message me. Just let me know. But anyway, you guys have a safe day, and take care.